what I learned from being a policy maker in that crisis was that first, there are not only one type of banking crisis, but actually two. And the way to distinguish between the two is that whether it's a 5% problem or 95% problem. If 5% of the banks are bad, but the rest are okay, then you use one way to handle it. But if all banks have the same problem at the same time, the 95% problem, then you have to think completely differently. And the two that I had to handle myself, both as the Federal Reserve New York economist on the first one, and on the second one, I got involved in the Japanese banking issues because of the previous experience that I had, were the second variety, the 95% type. And what happens when all the banks have the same problem at the same time? Well, you cannot use market solutions anymore because you try to force them to dump their non-performing loans. Well, if one or two banks dumping, it's okay because there are plenty of other buyers. But if 95% of them dump, the remaining 5 cannot buy. Then the whole thing will just come crashing down. And I learned this as an economist at the New York Fed when the Latin American debt crisis happened in 1982, when Mexico went belly up on this August 1982. Until August 1982, we were telling the American banks from the New York Fed to get themselves out of Latin America, because at that time they were all run by military dictatorship or something close to it, horrible economic fundamentals, budget deficit, current account deficit, inflation going through the roof, triple digit or something. And so we wanted these guys to pull themselves out of Latin America. And we issued warning for full 3 years, from 1979 to 1982, and American banks completely ignored our warnings, doubled their exposure. And when the crisis happened, August 1982, we were vindicated, right? So, yes, we were vindicated. Now we're going to tell them what to do. We got a call from Paul Volcker that morning, Friday. And the call basically said, do everything possible to make sure that not a single US bank will pull out of Mexico, that they continue lending, knowing fully well that Mexico is completely bankrupt. So we're completely shocked by this directive. But at that time, even at that time, New York Fed had a computer connections where we could tell how much exposure major American banks have against these countries. And when we looked at it, it was a 95% problem. So we immediately realized why Paul Volcker told us to do what we did. So that taught me a lot of things about this type of banking crisis, that you have to go slowly. Then the Japanese get into a similar problem because Japanese commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide, not just a little corner of Tokyo, but everywhere falling 87%. Now, in any country, if the real estate prices fall 87, there won't be much banks left and there won't be much economy either. But because I had that Latin American experience, I immediately told the Japanese policymakers, you go slowly, don't go too fast, inject capital right away. And I actually got the capital injection package moving. It's an extremely unpopular thing to do, right? Saving banks that screw themselves up is never a good political thing to do. But luckily, I have a Japanese surname. My name, Ku, is a Taiwanese name. So I was able to say things that other Japanese couldn't say because it's so politically incorrect. But I went out and said it anyway and got this whole movement going. We got the capital injection, and then the credit crunch was resolved. And then you look at what happened after 2008. I'm saddened to note that a lot of the institutional memory of the Latin American debt crisis are completely lost at the Federal Reserve. So they didn't know that Paul Volcker actually did those things until I told them much later. I didn't know that they lost that memory. I thought there would be a few people like me who had to do that still at the Fed, but this is 30 years later. So they made a number of mistakes, especially in letting the Lehman fail the way it failed. There are so many things the authorities could have done, but they thought they didn't have the authorities to do this, or the resolution package wasn't in place, and all these basically legal talks. But at that time, when we were doing it back in 1980s, we didn't have those authorities either. But we had to do it anyway to save the system.
On that point, what changed? You would think that regulators would have learned from having past experience that they could make these changes. So what happened?
Well, they were never formally on the law books, what the Paul Volcker actually did, or what I had to do on the phone calls to all these banks. In fact, when you think about it, if the central bank tells you to lend the money to someone that's completely bankrupt, is this legal? It's pretty shaky. And when we were doing it at the New York Fed, we felt pretty shaky too. Can we do actually things like this? But we had to do it, given the circumstances. So what I was proposing in that session was that these things should be formalized. That if the authorities determine that there's a systemic banking crisis, authorities should have certain powers that they normally do not use under ordinary circumstances. But when you're in this type of crisis, they should have a very clear set of powers telling banks what to do. That those critical powers should be formalized in order to fight this kind of crisis, 95% type crisis.
We do have some regulations now after the 2008 crisis, but are they enough? I mean, could it happen again?
In my view, the authorities got the so-called resolution authorities, right? So if you have a banking failing or any financial institutions failing, the authorities can come in and do something. But I think they're still missing the point. And that is that when you have a 95% problem, that means it's not one institution, it's all institutions. It's not, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, it's not because Lehman was a relatively large financial institutions and well connected. That's not the issue. The issue is that everyone else had the same problem Lehman had. So I know that you have those problem CDOs. You know that I have your problem CDOs. Then no one knows the value of these CDOs. That's why the whole thing collapsed. I cannot lend you money and you cannot lend me money. But financial institutions, you always have to go back and forth, right? So all of that stopped because of the mutual trust. Because I know you have the CDOs and you know I have the CDOs. That I don't think is fully addressed in Frank Dodd and all those measures that are now under discussions, or Basel III, or for that matter.
You do hear people on the banking side saying, oh, there's too much regulation. It's an imposition. It raises the cost of doing business. We don't need it. We don't like it, etc. What do you say to that side of the argument?
Well, I'm sure those regulators who were asleep at the controls wants to put all the regulations to kind of make up for what they were not doing correctly before. But when you think about it, the bankers who screwed up lost their jobs. Politicians who screwed up lost their jobs. But the regulators who screwed up never lost their jobs, right? Or some of the professors who didn't see this coming are still talking to the students as though they have something to tell them, when in their minds they didn't have the right model of what was actually happening. And so in that sense, I'm somewhat sympathetic with the bankers too. Says, God, you were asleep on the controls. How come you're now telling us what to do when you didn't have a right model in your head either? And some regulations, I think, are necessary. And banks taking these crazy risks, not just banks, any financial institutions taking huge risks just so that they can make big money. And then when they lose it, somehow becomes taxpayers' burden. Something has to be put between the two. So make sure that it's those guys who screwed up that pays for it and not the taxpayers.
Okay, Richard, great stories and great history lessons. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.